So good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's webinar. I'm very happy to invite and welcome Dr. Shashidhar Jagadeeshan, who has been working for many years with the Center for Learning, a small teacher-run school on the outskirts of Bangalore. Shashidhar has a PhD in mathematics from Syracuse University and has taught the subject at both school and undergrad levels. He's also been exploring for many years, engaging with the teachings of Krishnamurti and particularly their bearing on our work as teachers and in education. So his subject today is flow of meaning and the space of dialogue in our work in education. Before we begin, just one thing regarding procedure. At any point during Shashidhar's talk, you're welcome to type your messages in the chat. And after the talk is over, I'll be putting some of the questions which come in the messages to Shashidhar and he'll respond to them. So do keep in mind that your questions are welcome in the chat. So welcome, Shashi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to thank Siddharth, of course, for giving me this opportunity, and the Krishnamurti Foundation India for also giving me this chance to share this presentation. So let us begin. Anybody who reads the newspaper will realize that our house is in disorder. There are two major wars happening currently, and many small skirmishes happening across the world. There have been extreme weather events ranging from fire to blizzards to hurricanes. There is a massive biodiversity loss. According to the Living Planet Index, wildlife populations have plummeted by 69% between 1970 and 2018. There's great social and economic inequality. So the World Inequality Report 2022 from the World Inequality Lab says that 10% of the world population owns 76% of wealth, takes in 52% of income, and accounts for 48% of all global emissions. There are also deep divisions within human society. This is evident when we open our newspapers. There's also a sense of alienation among individuals. If you Google depression rates and suicide rates post-COVID, it's a very grim picture. For Krishnamurti, the crisis in the world is not an economic or social crisis, but a crisis in the mind, in consciousness. So to me, it feels like to respond to this crisis, there's of course the individual response, and there is the collective response. There's a general feeling that what we need, certainly this late in the game, are collective responses. Perhaps we feel that individual action is too little, too late. But I believe at Krishnamurti that this division into the individual and the collective is a false one. So like I was saying, it's very clear to anybody who opens the newspaper that our house is in disorder. There are two major wars, many small skirmishes all over. There are extreme weather events from fire to blizzards to hurricanes. The biodiversity loss is rapid and alarming. I was quoting the Living Planet Index, which says that for example, the wildlife populations have plunged by 69% between 1970 in 2018. There's great social and economic inequality. If you look at the World Inequality Report 2022, it says 10% of the world population owns 76% of the wealth, takes in 52% of income, and accounts for 48% of global carbon. There's also deep division within human society, leading to some very violent events. And there's also alienation at the individual level. Post COVID, there are alarming reports about rates of depression, rates of suicide, and so on. So, for Krishnamurti, this crisis in the world is not an economic or social crisis, but a crisis in the mind, in consciousness. This crisis demands perhaps individual response and collective response. There's a general feeling that what we need, certainly this late in the game, are collective responses. Perhaps we feel that individual action is too little, too late. But I believe at Krishnamurti that this division into the individual and the collective is a false one. So, in this webinar, I will begin by exploring what a collective response would entail, see how the collective response is tied in with the individual response. I will then share our experience in creating a learning community as a response to the challenges posed by the crisis. Interestingly, educational spaces like schools provide an ideal setting to understand the interplay between the individual and the collective. It's very clear that given the nature of challenges confronting human beings, we need unprecedented, widespread cooperation. Human beings do cooperate. When we are confronted with natural disasters, when we are driven by fear, desire, greed, or anger, when we can easily identify the other and protect us from them, when we agree on an idea or have a common ideology or a belief system. These ideas can be very abstract: money, a nation state, or moral imperatives. Clearly, some forms of cooperation are dangerous, leading to suffering and destruction either in the immediate or in the long term. But what is more obvious is a serious lack of cooperation in addressing the crisis in front of us. Each of us will recognize this lack of cooperation at multiple levels: in our daily relationships, in our homes and neighborhoods, at work, at national and global levels. So, what blocks cooperation? And what is the issue with our current modes of cooperation? As we've seen earlier, perhaps when there's an immediate danger in front of us, we do cooperate. But otherwise, our cooperation is driven by ideas or emotions. Ideas and emotions can bring us together, but they also contain the seeds of division. Religious ideas and beliefs have often served as a basis to bring people together. But we can see from the splintering that soon happens within religions that ideas are bound to lead to interpretations, and each interpretation leads to a new faction. Nations too could be seen as a way of bringing smaller tribes together for mutual benefit. But soon, when people feel that their interest is not being met, they will demand that they secede and form their own new nation. Even when people come together with good ideas for a good cause, what Freud calls the narcissism of small differences eventually fragments their efforts. At a smaller scale, we see many families unable to hold together in spite of deep emotional and biological bonds. Even when we come together where the intent is very clear where it seems factual. Our brains are conditioned to convert intent into ideas. We deeply believe in our ideas, they seem completely logical and coherent, and we have no reason to doubt them. But they're ideas, by which I mean we hold our questions and our perceptions conceptually in the form of words, pictures, emotions, and in memory. More importantly, they are a part of our self, our identity. They have become part of the framework from which we experience the world. But without ideas, what is the ground from which we can cooperate? For Krishnamurti, in exploring the limitations of our conditioning, perhaps together, we will be able to create a new culture, spontaneously and effortlessly, in which we can live with sensitivity, insight, and love. It is interesting that Krishnamurti suggests we can begin by exploring our conditioning, rather than changing it, wishing it away, or finding means to circumvent it. The ground for cooperation is in turning the light onto oneself. So, what is this art of exploring our conditioning, whether individually or collectively? I would like to suggest that this is what dialogue can be. The notion of dialogue has been around with human beings for centuries. For example, the Native Americans had what is called the circle of discourse. It was non hierarchical, all participants were respected, and listening and speaking were equally important. In the Indian tradition, the idea of the Upanishad was to sit near to discuss fundamental questions about life and existence. There is the famous idea of the Socratic dialogue. Here, the idea was to reach a state of aporia or a state of puzzlement. And this was done through logical questioning of assumptions constantly till you reached a point where you could not answer any questions anymore and you reached a state of puzzlement. Understanding then follows. In all these attempts, perhaps it happened in small groups and in an individual search to understand the nature of reality. How do we address this huge crisis in human consciousness? For Bohm, dialogue, as we are choosing to use the word, is a way of exploring the roots of the many crises that face humanity today. It enables inquiry into and understanding of the sorts of processes that fragment and interfere with real communication between individuals, nations, and even different parts of the same organization. In our modern culture, when men and women are able to interact with one another in many ways, they can sing, dance, or play together with little difficulty. But their ability to talk together about subjects that matter deeply to them seems invariably to lead to dispute, division, and often to violence. In our view, this condition points to a deep and pervasive defect in the process of human thought. He goes on, the word dialogue derives from two roots, dia, which means through, and logos, which means the word, or more particularly, the meaning of the word. The image it gives is a river of meaning flowing around and through the participants. Any number of people can engage in dialogue. One can even have a dialogue with oneself. I like that description of dialogue as a flow of meaning among and within participants. For me, the word meaning implies understanding and shared intent. Bohm explored the word meaning a great deal, and he says, for example, You see, only meaning can arouse energy. However, there's always the danger of shared meaning becoming another idea or conclusion. The word flow, however, suggests fluidity, a lack of rigidity, and this idea of a flow perhaps guards against the earlier dangers that I mentioned. So, I have been part of many dialogues in small groups with students, with teachers, with parents, and so on. So, I have a pretty good sense of what dialogue is not. It's not a debate. No one is in it to win an argument. It's not necessarily meant to arrive at a conclusion. However, at the end of a dialogue, some understanding, some collective action might emerge. It's not motivated to have only by having to solve problems. But again, at the end of a dialogue, we might find the solution to a problem. It's not a group therapy session. We're not seeking personal comfort through dialogue. Yet, at the end of a dialogue, one might have an insight and that might heal us psychologically. Perhaps Krishnamurti is the best person to give a positive definition of dialogue. In dialogue, we can discover the need to completely set aside our personal conditioning, to die to our own beliefs and formulated experiences, making it possible to see in that unique mirror of relationship the whole world, the whole truth of what is. Then, if we share in the same spirit of inquiry, intensity, and affection, we may actually find ourselves thinking together, not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing, but seeing, understanding, and thereby sharing as one the same reality. Krishnamurti spoke a great deal about the act of thinking together and the act of seeing together. When two people observe with the same intensity, freedom, and clarity, they see the same thing. Seeing together to me is different from common notions that drive cooperation. Everyone's opinions counts. Let's agree to disagree. Let's vote. We must tolerate diverse views. Bring in multiple perspectives. All of these somehow retain the seeds of division, work around or manage them. Therefore, they're limited and potentially dangerous. The act of seeing together seems to happen when we have a common insight, which is not based on ideas and concepts. Seeing together has the capacity to distinguish the real from the false. So it doesn't have the danger that we will come together because of a myth or some belief. There is an inbuilt feature of self-correction. In seeing together, if we are thinking mistakenly, perhaps there's a chance to correct it. Dialogue to me is the essential tool to think and see together in a questioning and gently skeptical way. The act of seeing together seems to happen when we put aside self interest, our particular preferences, opinions, beliefs, and conclusions. Once we see something together, meaning flows and cooperation then becomes effortless. Freedom is the essence of thinking together. You must be free from your concepts, prejudices, and so on. I too must be free, and we come together in this freedom. It means dropping all our conditioning. It implies complete attention without any past. The present world crisis demands that we totally abandon our tribal instincts that have become glorified as nationalism. Thinking together implies that we totally abandon self interest and identifying ourselves as British Arab, Russian, and so on. So therefore, the collective response is one that takes dialogue and cooperation of this different order. But isn't it essentially a reflection of the individual's response? The role of the individual is already apparent, built into what has been shared so far. But let us take a few minutes to elaborate. One of Krishnamurti's key teachings is the statement, "You are the world." I understand this rather amazing statement to mean that human consciousness is one. In understanding ourselves, we understand all of humanity. The sense that we are separate individuals may be an illusion. This sense of separation makes us relate to the world from a self centered perspective, which might be the most dangerous thing on earth. Seeing the state of the world and of ourselves, it behoves each one of us to bring about a radical transformation within ourselves. One is not different from the society in which we live. The world is us, and we are the world. The division between the individual and the community, the me and the you, the we and they, has caused so much mischief in the world, so much misery and confusion. And any serious person, I do not mean by that an intellectual, but one who is involved in the whole process of living, must bring about this transformation within themselves. Who is the human being? And this change cannot be brought about unless there's a total freedom from conditioning. Krishnamurti clearly points out that society at large is the result of the relationship among its members. If the members function from a deep sense of division and are driven constantly by the urge for self protection, then the society we create will reflect this. The individual and society mirror each other. The response to the current crisis demands that as individuals, we are constantly watchful about how our conditioning is operating. And from this watchfulness, we think, see, and act together. The watchfulness is not out of fear, judgment, or effort. Can we discover what this watching would entail? As pointed out in earlier webinars, Kay felt that education could be a space for this discovery and the key to the regeneration of society. Schools are a microcosm of society. At the heart of creating a school lies the question, what kind of society do we wish to create and live in? I'm going to now spend a little time talking about Center for Learning, a school that I've been associated for the last 30 years. CFL has been inspired by the teachings of Krishnamurti. It was a day school from 1990 to 2000 and is currently a semi-residential school located 40 kilometers due west from Bangalore. CFL is a teacher-run school. It has a flat structure with no hierarchy among its teachers. I'll be talking about these two aspects in greater detail later. The school exists to become aware of how conditioning of various kinds leads to division, explore whether it's possible to live and act from a ground of compassion rather than division. So what's absolutely essential to our education? Now, this is something that has been shared by other speakers, and these are common for all Krishnamurti schools. So what I'll be saying may be a repetition. The relationship between teacher and student has to be based on affection and mutual respect. No traditional motivators like fear, competition, reward, and punishment. Learning rather than guaranteed outcomes is at the heart of everything we do. For Krishnamurti, learning was intimately tied with the acts of listening and looking, both of which are part of attention. I don't know if you've ever examined how you listen. It doesn't matter to what, whether to a bird, to the wind in the leaves, to the rushing waters, or how you listen to a dialogue within yourself, to your conversation in various relationships with your intimate friend, your wife or husband. If we try to listen, we find it extraordinarily difficult because we are always projecting our opinions and ideas, our prejudices, our backgrounds, our inclinations, our impulses. When they dominate, we hardly listen to what is being said. In that state, there is no value at all. One listens and therefore learns only in a state of attention, a state of silence, in which this whole background is in abeyance, is quiet. Then it seems to me it's possible to communicate. Also, there's the art of seeing, to see things as they are, not as you wish to see them, to see things without any illusion, without any preconceived judgment, opinion, to see actually what is, not your conclusions about what is. Then the art of learning, not memorizing, which becomes very mechanical because our brains, our minds, our brains have already become so extraordinarily mechanical. So the art of learning implies freedom to observe, to listen without prejudice, without argumentation, without any emotional, romantic responses. Here's Krishnamurti talking about attention. When your teacher tells you to pay attention in class, what does he mean? He means that you must not look out of the window, that you must withdraw your attention from everything else and concentrate wholly on what you're supposed to be studying. Or when you're absorbed in a novel, your whole mind is so concentrated on it that for the moment you've lost interest in everything else. That is another form of attention. So, in the ordinary sense, paying attention is a narrowing down process, is it not? But I think there's a different kind of attention, a state of mind which is not exclusive, which does not shut out anything. And because there's no resistance, the mind is capable of much greater attention. Recognizing the need for all members of the CFL community to think together, a great deal of time and energy is set aside for dialogue for its own sake. At the risk of repeating myself, these are spaces to share observations about the nature of our conditioning, confront the common consciousness that we share, have an insight into the ways in which we function at many levels: emotional, intellectual, physical, and perhaps come upon an intelligence which will inform our actions. Interestingly, it's also possible to see that dialogue is a way to communicate even while teaching subjects, where the teacher might be expected to know more. Because in our classes too, meaning must flow between teacher and taught. What did we mean for the flow of meaning in a classroom? So it usually begins with a teacher asking a question or making a brief presentation. Then there's a free flow of conversation. Questioning is constantly encouraged. The role of the teacher as an authority figure is kept light. Meaning is gradually built. The teacher bringing in knowledge and skill interwoven with the student's thinking process. All this to enable a flow of meaning among the participants. I don't know if I've mistakenly conveyed that all we do is sit and talk in CFL. It's definitely not a verbal experience. So we are a community of over 150 individuals, ranging from 6-year-olds to over 60. Students, teachers, and parents have to cooperate at many levels and over many things for the community to function smoothly. How does this happen in a learning community which questions traditional methods of authority, fear, and ambition? Our work at CFL is to meet the challenges of relating and working together. There are, of course, different demands on students, parents, and teachers, but obviously there are many overlapping demands too. So, after sharing in broad brushstrokes the demands on each member of the community, I will explain how we use dialogues, perhaps instrumentally, to meet these demands. What do I mean by instrumentally? While dialogues may range or may help in problem solving, to collective decision making, and to help in conflict resolution. So let's begin with the demands on the young. So a demand on a young is not to intentionally hurt anyone, respect common spaces and property, respecting agreed upon times when we do things together, following norms of behavior that have been created together, especially in the areas of sexuality, substance abuse, and safety. For older students, we would expect that they take active ownership in creating and maintaining the ethos of the school. We must remember that students have not necessarily signed up for this education. They're here because their parents want this education for them. Like it or not, there's an asymmetric power relationship between adults and young people. Therefore, it's all the more important to create a safe and democratic space where the voices of all participants are respected and heard. What are the ways in which we do it? We have something called open forums where the whole school meets together to discuss common concerns. One simple example is we all wash our utensils together. So if we suddenly find that the plates are not being washed well, we might call for a whole school meeting to see why, what is the cause of inattention that is leading to this? Why are we motivated to do this? We have created a special space called the Wednesday meeting where seniors meet together once a week to discuss what the demands of living together in a semi-residential community means. This is an especially special place because this is really exploring the nature of democracy. What would it mean when several of us are living together, sharing the same living spaces, and having to cooperate at many levels? How do we meet misdemeanors? When one of us does something that's hurtful, how do we meet this without resorting to traditional ways like punishment or consequently? Here too, dialogue is our main tool. We'd like to sit together and understand and see if we can understand why, what caused us to hurt. Can we learn from this? Moving on to the demands on parents. Parents need to work with the teacher body in understanding the philosophy of the school so that the adults in a child's life are not pulling in different directions. There must be alertness to one's fears, ambitions, and aspirations so that we don't pass these on to our children or mold the school based on these. The school and home should not be at odds with each other in their relationship to discipline, learning, food, media, and sleep. Can the parents and teachers help a child feel completely secure? What does this mean? If there's conflict at home, how will a child feel secure? Can the engagement with students on the philosophical questions not be seen as only the teacher's work? Again, we have several forums of talking together and thinking together. We have a monthly Sunday meeting, which happens on the last Sunday of each month, where we go into fundamental questions. These meetings are not about academic accomplishments or behavioral issues and so on, but really to understand why we've come together, what's the fundamental questions driving this education and so on. And this Sunday meeting is extended 3 times a year into parent retreats. These happen over weekends. They come in on a Saturday afternoon and go back after lunch on Sunday, where again, there's a greater sense of leisure to explore these questions. We have what are called chit chat meetings, where we sit down one-on-one with each parent and actually revisit the questions that brought us together. Before a parent comes into the community, we have a weekend retreat again to introduce them to the questions of the school in a leisurely manner. Now, moving to demands on teachers. So, we said CFL is a teacher-run school. Well, it means that we are responsible for all aspects of the school. There's no division between administration and teaching, no division between teaching and cleaning spaces and so on. The fact is that we are non-hierarchical. That means everybody has a say. And this demands that we do not play the role of either a foot soldier or the general. Collective decision making implies starting with the intent to cooperate from the very beginning and see the importance of thinking together. CFL is the result of the collective understanding of its members. So every member has to be proactive about maintaining the ethos of the school. How do we do this? Well, we meet frequently, and each meeting is an opportunity to listen and think together. We have consciously set aside time once in 2 weeks to explore fundamental questions without any agenda. New teachers have a separate space to slowly open up our questions. We have annual teacher retreats, both as a space to clean house and to explore fundamental questions. What do I mean by clean house? In relating constantly day in and day out, perhaps hurts accumulate. And how do we end these hurts? It would be fair to say that CFL has put in an enormous energy to create a coherent learning community, trying to stay true to its intent. On a daily basis, we do what we do because it makes sense, and there's really no other alternative if one is interested in responsible education. Naturally, we've had our challenges along the way. What is humbling is that while our attempts make sense and are absolutely necessary, they're not sufficient in meeting the challenge of awakening intelligence that Krishnamurti posed to educators. Let me explain. So let's begin with challenges with children. As this learning process is taking place, simultaneously there's the creation of a learner. The learner to whom learning is happening seem separate from the learning. Thus, the child begins adding layers of information to their sense of self. This is not the same thing as metacognition, which is an understanding of the skills and knowledge that one has. In the context of school learning, the child may experience insecurities, comparisons, inadequacies, pride, or arrogance. A benign environment is not enough to avert all these self related knots. By the way, we could change this word learning to experiencing, and then all of us will be in this boat, being the experiencer. As I said earlier, children have not necessarily signed up for this journey, so they may resist this process of trying to understand our conditioning, feeling it is imposed from the outside. They're not yet They are yet to experience for themselves the danger of some of the things that we may be pointing out. Finally, in their daily lives, they do experience many of the aspects of conditioning that we are talking about. Feeling isolated and lonely, sense of fear and insecurity about the future, forming groups which include which include some and exclude others, pursuing pleasure at great cost. They're often unwilling to let go of their sorrow because they believe that the alternative is a loss of all pleasure. What about parents? It's really a huge challenge caring for other people's children. Here, we are working with a deep instinct to protect one's own young. So, the dialogue is a process of opening up what is a responsible way of bringing up the young so that they live with a deep sense of well being. A well being that is inclusive in nature and which has compassion and sensitivity as its main pillars. It's clear that individual well being without well being for society at large is rather limited. And now to teachers, we are subject to all the forces I mentioned earlier. We convert, as I said, intent into ideas all the time and to have to watch out for it. We experience both the pull of conformity and the pull of wanting to be different. Like the children, we too are concerned about our image and how we come across. Our images of each other, built up over time, prevent listening. Our emotions can overwhelm the conversation, and relationship may break under the force of our egos. In any of these situations, one could say the flow of meaning is blocked by seemingly inevitable forces. So we return to the challenge that David Bohm posed. Human beings can sing, dance, or play together with little difficulty, but their ability to talk together about subjects that matter deeply to them seems invariably to lead to dispute, division, and often to violence. And yet, if we see the choiceless nature of our challenges on a daily basis, there are many times when we share as one the same reality and meaning flows. And when meaning flows, there's a quality of relatedness that comes when there's no conflict. There's a joy of cooperation, a release of creative energy, and this is palpable to all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shashi, for that extraordinarily lucid and systematic journey of what this means to all the constituents in a school and, of course, to human beings generally, keeping in the backdrop the kinds of issues that we are confronted with as individuals and the world. I have a few questions, but I'd like to begin with questions which are here in the Q&A. Incidentally, I had earlier mentioned that you could type your questions in the chat. I think that may not be possible, but please do feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A. So the question I'd like to begin with is, and this is a question in the Q&A, is, you mentioned that for dialogue to happen, self-interest needs to be sort of in abeyance. So the question is, how does one keep self-interest aside in order to have dialogue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's the pressing question at all times. I think we can't go in having a plan, walk into the room saying, okay, I'll keep self-interest outside the room and then walk in. I think the only thing that we can do is, if possible, is to keep watching how the self-interest is manifesting in how I want to shape the conversation, in how I'm pushing my agenda, how I'm dominating the conversation, and so on. So I think as our self-interest manifests in various ways, maybe if we are watchful, then it is in abeyance.
In fact, that leads to a question that's just come in the Q&A, which is how can one develop the art of listening and watching?
I think with listening, I read somebody who said, look, listening apart from a few nanoseconds is always happening in the now. So, in a sense, at every moment of our lives, there is one of the senses, that is our ears, can be open to a whole lot of things that are coming in. So, I feel that daily life offers immense opportunities to listen, right? Even right now, as we are sitting here, perhaps there's a fan in the background, perhaps there's a bird calling, perhaps there's somebody honking on the road. Uh, so I think there's a constant opportunity to listen, and once one becomes curious about this act of listening, one will see how difficult that is, and how easily one gets, how our thinking takes over and takes us away in so many directions. So I don't know if we need to do anything special. Daily life gives us plenty of opportunities, especially to listen.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, there are these opportunities, and yet it doesn't seem to happen because for various reasons, some of which you mentioned. I mean, we are preoccupied with various things, our minds are inattentive, and so on, right? And there is also this dilemma which Krishnaji points out that, there's listening, but there is no trying to listen because there again the self is coming in, and that in some sense negates the listening. So I know in the Krishnamurti world, how is a bad word. So let me try and ask the question without using it. Uh, what does one do? The mind is preoccupied. One sees somewhere the importance of the listening mind, and yet the mind is not listening.
I guess we're all, I don't know, I wouldn't like to come across as having any magic wand to listening, or having cracked the problem of inattention or, uh, distraction. But I think at least I think for many of us, there is still this curiosity as to what it means, because the other, we've seen the cost of the other. When there's inattention, invariably there is hurt, or there is something that we do which is rather unintelligent. So I think that constant curiosity about what would it mean to listen, what would it mean to listen without a whole lot of noise coming in. I think that curiosity is the only thing, that intention is the only thing that I can say that one has to hang on to, right? Because yeah, it is rather easy to give up given the difficulty of listening and the habits of the mind, and And K talked somewhere that maybe the brain has started protecting itself so much that it's incapable of letting go of many of these things. And we can see that personally, the challenge of that. But I think yet there's a big part of us which is very curious. What would it mean to just listen? And sometimes listening happens, spontaneously. And then you get a flavor for what would it mean to just listen, right? Uh,
Right. Yeah.
but
Thank you.
I think we have to be curious about it. And I think the danger is to conclude that it's not possible. I would say that once we've concluded that it's not possible, then maybe we are not even open to the possibility of listening.
Right. And that's very subtle, isn't it? I mean, it can happen, this conclusion that it's not possible can happen in spite of your wanting to somewhere believe that it is in fact possible. But anyway, let me move. Here's another interesting question. You mentioned that dialogue and other processes at CFL are not sufficient to bring about the awakening of intelligence. What else is necessary in your view to bring this about?
I- Well, I mean, if I knew, then. But I think there's a bit of a conundrum here that, I'm often stuck by because it feels like we need intelligence to be able to do what we are doing, right? Yet we are, and in fact, Kay would suggest start from the other shore, right? So I don't know if I fully understand that. It seems like we are conditioned human beings who are often trapped by our own conditioning, yet something in what Kay has said has appealed to us, something about the possibility. Because partly the other doesn't seem to lead us anywhere. I think that is very clear. Functioning through thought to encouraging the self or using traditional motivators like reward, punishment, fear is clearly unintelligent, right? So, what is it that will bring about an awakening of intelligence? I can't really answer that. But it seems that best intentions and best programs with the most intense hard work doesn't cut it in some sense. It needs it needs something that is uh, of a different quality. Maybe what the Beatles said, love. You know.
Yeah, right. Here, I mean, there are two related questions. I'll ask both of them together. Uh, One is, does understanding the significance of silence aid the art of listening and watching? And there's a kind of complementary question, which is perhaps the question is not what is listening, rather, why are we so distracted?
Yeah, I would go with the second question that, I mean, I don't know. Here I'm making a jump, but I feel silence is a byproduct. It's not something that you can actively seek. And that I think what is only available to us is our distraction. And what's only available and accessible to our consciousness is the noise. And I mean, perhaps one has to begin by becoming aware of that. And I think that happens many times in our daily life. For example, we might be going for a walk completely lost in our thought, and then you become aware that you're lost in your thought, right? So there is that possibility of having a view which is not part of being lost in thought about the nature of our thinking, right? And, perhaps will creep in when there is that quiet, when there is an abeyance of our thinking or the restlessness has subsided. But I don't know if we can actively practice listening, uh, you know, as a goal to be achieved.
In fact, it seems that one thing that's very central to Krishnamurti's discourse is that you can't directly approach any of the things we consider positive. You
Yeah.
can only look at the things which come in their way, and then something happens. Now, there's a question here regarding insight. In fact, it's a statement followed by a question. And insight happens, it occurs. Is it a controlled process? I think it isn't. Bringing a school or community together is a controlled act to build something meaningful. In what ways can we build something or make our environment to work together with some insight?
So if am I correct to say there are two parts to this question? One is about insight itself, and then what's the what is the ground, what's the basis for a school so that insight can happen, right?
Yes, I think the questioner has this feeling that insight cannot happen through a controlled process. And yet, a school, in some sense, is a controlled uh, entity. So, how does insight then come in? Is it possible to work together with insight?
Yeah, I mean, uh, the questioner is right. I mean, there is no process or no machine through which we can put somebody and out of which you come out and you have insight. I think that's the beauty of insight, that it's not a planned process, it's not a controlled process, it's not an outcome of some process, and so. But if but I think there is an environment in which insight can potentially happen. And I think the environment has to be where the brain is free to play, where the brain is not feeling under tremendous pressure, where there are, where we don't amplify forces of division and so on. I think in such an environment, and maybe that's why K suggested schools, that in an environment where there isn't constant pressure on the brain to achieve, to compete, to have ambitions, and so on, such a brain may be capable or more open to insight. And it's definitely true in a small way. We can say that in a classroom, when there is attention, where both the teacher and the students are bringing in a certain energy of attention, insight happens. That is a common sharing happens. And of course, that insight perhaps is verbal, it needs some background knowledge and so on. It may it has the flavor of what Kay is saying, but it may not be the insight that he's talking about. Yet we can see that when there is affection, when there is attention, understanding can happen. I mean, and I'm using understanding interchangeably with insight, right? And and even in certain difficult circumstances, when you listen very carefully to somebody, at the end of it, it's not the logical steps that matter, but there's a leap that happens and there's an aha moment that happens. And this is what makes for good classes or not good classes, or a good, uh, you know, when you go to a session where it has made sense to you, that that's been an aha moment. Uh, so yeah, I think there are conducive environments which allow for insight to happen, but it doesn't guarantee that insight will happen.
So, in a school like CFL and several other schools, perhaps a great deal of thought and sensitivity goes into creating that kind of environment where a flow of meaning may happen through dialogue. And yet, as you've pointed out, it's not something that can be taken for granted. You can create the space for it and what appear to be the necessary conditions for it, but there are a lot of things which make it difficult. And that is even in these kinds of, let us say, somewhat controlled environments. And I don't mean control in a negative sense here. So one question I have then is, because you began with looking at painting a picture that's of the whole world. So there's a global phenomenon that's happening, and there are problems of various kinds: division, environment, inequality, all of that, wars, right? Do you see any, to put it crudely, is there any possibility of scaling up dialogue? Is there possibility for dialogue on a larger scale?
Uh, I think we as human beings have the capacity when we see something is very dangerous to act together, right? So, uh, you know, so that's my only hope that somehow we see the absolute danger of what we are doing, and that brings us together and, working together, right? So, I mean, I don't know how many people can think and talk together. It's only been done meaningfully in small scales, but I don't think there's any number. The fact of seeing danger, I don't think is dependent on number. And somehow we have to see that unless we see something as very dangerous and feel the urgency of coming together and working together and thinking together, and Kay would keep saying everything is together, not individually and so on. And somehow there has to be that urgency. Somehow the problem with self-interest is it allows you to be in a narrow thing and think that that is the best strategy for the present, right? So, uh, you know, I don't know. That's my only response.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one, there are a couple of other questions from the Q&A I'd like to ask, but before that, just one quick follow-up question, which is, the children who go through our schools and through this nurturing environment that is at least interested in dialogue, even if it doesn't always happen, uh, what do you think their experience is like when they leave? And they may be in environments where it is, in fact, all about winning arguments. And increasingly, public discourse is extremely polarized. And so, how do our children, what do our children make? Or let me not limit it to children. After all, you've spoken equally of parents and the teachers, right? How does this operate in our lives outside the school?
I think we are in particularly difficult times, and I would say it's not easy for young people today. I think that, uh, you know, I'm sure every young person, no matter when they were born, had challenges ahead of them. But I think there are particular set of circumstances that are immensely challenging for human beings today, right? Like global, I mean, there's deep depression caused by global warming. People don't want to have children because they don't feel the point of bringing children into this world, and so things seems to be closing in at some level. So I feel that we can't underestimate what human beings are going through right now, right? And uh, so I think, well, students who pass out of these schools, of course, they have a certain privilege, which we must not deny, that they come from certain socially advantaged classes, they have social capital. So they are, in some sense, at an advantage from various other points, right? So we're not talking about children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds and so on, right? But and many things do shock them. I think they've grown up in an environment where people are not actively hostile or not actively out to get you, or actually block democratic processes and so on. So I think they do find it somewhat shocking sometimes, but they also find their ways in this world. But I think more than that, I think each one has to ask. So, I mean, Kay put it very well. How do you live sanely in an insane world? Right. So, I think these children have been exposed to many things. They've been actually told about the possibility of paying attention to your own thought process, to your own emotions. Right. And where does strength come from? Does it come from the outside or from inside? So in that sense, all the tools have been made available to them, right? How they respond, yeah, it's a very, very difficult environment, but how they respond again comes back to how much they understand about the nature of all these things, right? So it will keep coming back to how much do we understand ourselves and how much do we understand uh, mm, the nature of our thinking, the nature of fragmentation. So,
Okay. Here's an intriguing question. Would dialogue also have a place in a world without conflict and crises?
I don't know. I mean, in the world of knowledge, of course, right? I mean, often nowadays they say you only collaboration works in the area of knowledge. So definitely in discovering things, the idea of some person in an ivory tower of figuring out themselves is not so popular nowadays. So there's a great deal of cooperation and working together that is needed in the area of knowledge, in solving problems together and so on. But do you need, if you have deeply understood the nature of reality, will you seek out somebody else who has understood it to have a conversation? I don't know. One would only speculate about that.
Just to sort of shift ground a little, here is a very specific and I think deeply felt question. As a new teacher in a conventional hierarchical space of higher education, what does one do to deal with the rush that others are in to judge and conclude about the new teacher's behavior? I ask with reference to a situation where a new entrant's silence in departmental meetings is perceived as indifference. I truly appreciate your practice of providing new teachers with a space for clearing their issues.
So, I mean, it would be wrong of me to offer any specific solution and so on, but I think if there are older faculty, then it's their responsibility to create an environment where younger people are encouraged, where they feel that they have a voice and so on, right? And perhaps in such an environment, such a young person needs a mentor, somebody they can talk it over, somebody to, help them. You know. And so in CFL, we do have that when a young teacher joins, for 2 years, they have a mentor who works with them and talks to them, meets them regularly. Because it might be very confusing for them what they see, what they hear, how they process, and so on. So I think not just in CFL, it would make sense in any where we are interested in that young person and how they're going to quote unquote succeed in that environment, right? So I would say the responsibility, of course, is among for the older faculty and for the community at large to help the young person, but also there's the responsibility that the young person responds to that. And and if they're not responding, what is it that is causing them not to respond?
Yeah. In your experience at CFL, have you generally found that young people who join do in fact respond to that process of mentoring well, or does it remain very bewildering for them?
So I
What
would say
is,
by and large it has worked well. There have been some situations where there may be a chemistry has not worked out and so on. I don't think we can claim 100% success. There have been some situations where, for whatever reason, the mentor and the mentee have not been able to communicate well together. And then again, we should respond quickly to such a situation and see. But I think, yeah, it has helped, rather than the model of dumping somebody in the deep end of a swimming pool and you either, sink or survive. This process, I think, has helped for them to understand them. And it seems to take many, many years to understand the nuances of such education. For example, one of the challenges that a young teacher who comes in, maybe they would want to be friends with students, right? And and young and children gravitate to young people. They love hanging out with young people and so on. So it's a huge thing that they have to navigate. How do I'm not their friend necessarily, that is a huge challenge for a young teacher, right? And so, so there are many such areas that, I think having somebody who could help you, talk to you and discuss with you makes a huge difference.
Okay, we have still about 10 minutes left, and I have two related questions. I'll ask the first one and wait for your response before asking the other. And the first one is simply, what do we mean by intelligence?
Hmm. That's a webinar on its own, right? So I'll talk about intelligence the way Krishnamurti used the word because he used it differently. I think somewhere I think he said that the word come from interlagra or to read between the lines. So I think he was suggesting that uh, I mean, let me say what it's not for Krishnamurti. It's not the ability to solve a math problem very quickly, or to write a clever essay, or to have some fantastic theory, or to build a new machine, and so on. I think he would use the word intellect in that context. I think he is suggesting that there is a ground which is accessible to human beings, which is not personal. First of all, it is not belonging to anybody. So it's not that one person is somehow far more intelligent than the other person. So it's a ground which we can all partake from. But unfortunately, the catch is that he would suggest only when the self comes to an end that one can access such a ground. But it feels that this is part of some, he would use the words compassion, intelligence, love, beauty interchangeably. So it is something that is accessible to human beings. And when one acts from that ground, it feels that many of the knots that we have gotten into don't happen. So this is my understanding of how Krishnamurti uses the word intelligence. I can talk a lot about lack of intelligence, but mm, yeah.
I mean, I'm glad you brought in intelligence and the self because that leads to the related question. And here's a scenario.
Mm,
So there are two people, A and B. Suppose A acts from a space of intelligence, in other words, absence of the self, at least for a few moments. And the other person, B, still responds from a strong sense of self. Then A seems to get hurt because A feels that despite acting selflessly, it is not working out with B. What does A then do?
yeah, I guess we have to be a little careful with our words in some sense, in the sense that, hurt is a part of the self acting, right? I mean, in a way, if one were to be honest, hurt is self pity in some sense. Right? So the fact that A gets hurt means there is something invested in what we want. There is ourselves tied up in it. There is a picture of what we would like, and then maybe that picture has been broken that leads to hurt. So in that scenario, I'm not sure that we are functioning from, because maybe part of intelligence, which is very, very difficult, is that there are no expectations of outcomes, right, in our actions. And the minute we have a picture of what should be happening, we are going to end up feeling disappointed. So, yeah. So, I mean, again, like we said, I don't know if we can make a picture of these things because that is a danger of words and a danger of concepts that immediately we can create an idea of intelligence or an idea of many of these things, and then it doesn't seem to make sense after a point, right? So, uh, maybe we have to start by watching what is our investment, what is it that we want from the other, and so on.
Yeah, the self acts in subtle ways. Uh, here's a question. What does it mean to stay with intent and not function through ideas?
Uh, when a group of people come, even if they're very serious and they're very clear about the intent, soon the intent starts getting translated in our own way into certain ideas. And we have pictures of how, if we are true to the intent, this is what should be happening and so on, right? And I would say that that's where the conflict begins because we've converted intent into some tangible outcome, into some picture and so on. And then uh, conflict begins, right? So I don't know. I don't know what it would be not to convert intent to idea, but it seems like maybe we need to push back. We need to talk together and not come, not just immediately translate it into something that is actionable and measurable in some ways. Right? Uh, and keep going back and asking, so what was our intent? Uh, because otherwise, many minor aims and minor desirable qualities will start getting included in intent, which may actually have nothing to do with the original intent.
I mean, this brings us to one of the difficulties inherent in dialogue, or for that matter, even in discussion, which is simply language. We have different ways of using language, different degrees of competence in language, and so on, and we understand things in multiple ways. And so I'd like to come back to dialogue, and this might be the last question. This is again in the Q&A. How should one locate the role of the personal experience while in dialogue? Especially because the personal is often the most accessible starting point.
Uh, yeah, this is a good question. And in fact, this also blocks dialogue in the sense that for students, they feel that dialogue is about sharing their personal or that teachers are probing into their personal lives. And obviously, they don't want to share their intimate thoughts or feelings. And they won't want an invasion into an image forming of who they are based on the information we gather. I think there's a way of learning about the personal from a general point of view when we don't identify with the personal. So I might have got hurt by a specific thing that somebody said, right? And that's very personal and specific. But I think uh, if we watch, there's behind that a process that is happening, which is common, which is universal, which is nothing to do with a person, and there are some which we can talk about that without having to talk about ourselves and talk about our stories and our narrative, but we can say that I had a particular picture of myself or somebody else, and then when that picture was kind of destroyed or challenged, and it led to disturbance, and this has nothing to do with the person, but it's in a way authentic to what that person is going through. So I think the need to have personal stories is to be authentic and not talk in vague or general terms. But I think there's an art of watching the personal and from that learning what is the mechanism of our thinking and our emotions behind that. And I think dialogue is that art, right? Because ultimately what's available to us is personal in that sense, right? But the translation to that it's happening to only one specific organism to a me, I think that's a mistake, right? But so there is a universal happening in the personal. which
The
we
world
can.
is in you.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that statement, you are the world, I think it's one of the most sort of resonant and in some ways easy and in some ways very difficult things
Yeah.
to actually understand. There's actually a question related to the previous question about intent and idea, which is what do we mean by intent and how is it different from idea?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it may feel like we're splitting hairs and we're just trying to create more words for the same thing. But I think, for example, when people are attracted to, say, a Krishnamurti school, the intent is clear. Somehow, the intent is to see if we can be free of conditioning, right? Now, and I think the intent will be like a question or something that is, it's not like a, full blown idea that then can be carried out and can be interpreted and so on, right? And so I, I feel that intent has the seed of a question, of an exploration, of a possibility in it. And that I think one sees that intent at a gut level, at a visceral level, at a non-verbal level, right? Uh, and that's what brings us together, right? And and we often are not at odds with the intent in some sense. If we were at odds at the intent, we may not come together. But it's the translation of the intent or and so on that something starts happening at that point. That when we try to start translating the intent according to one's understanding, then division starts happening.
Yes, thanks, Shashi. I think that was very clear. It's just about five, but I think we'll have a concluding question if that's okay with you.
Yeah, yeah,
In
no,
fact,
no problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay. In fact, these are actually the last two questions, so I request that no more questions now. And these both have to do with dialogue again. Perhaps I'll read them all and you can see how you want to take them up. Before we engage in dialogue with the external world, is it not necessary to engage in a dispassionate dialogue with ourselves? If our internal dialogue itself ends up in conflict, will we be able to face the world in a peaceful manner? And the next question is also about, dialogue with oneself. What are some of the challenges in bridging the gap between self-dialogue and collective dialogue, especially when having a dialogue with the children, where the wavelength is more? I'm not sure I've understood the last phrase, but anyway, with children and with oneself.
So I think when Krishnamurti or even Bohm says you can have a dialogue with ourselves, I think that's different from the self-talk that we do. Mm. I feel that, for example, Sam Harris says this nice thing that he's walking in to give a talk and he sees a bottle of water and he says, I had this thought, oh, there's a bottle of water. Oh, good. And he said, I have no clue why I needed those thoughts. I mean, it's self-evident there's a bottle of water, and then, right? So I think there is a lot of our thoughts which it appears in the form of telling us things which are kind of like we are talking to ourselves. And I think that's actually chatter. And that's the way thought is like, oh, I need to get up now. Why do I have to say that? Right? I mean, who am I saying that I need to get up? Or often our thoughts are in that form, like somebody telling you what you should do, what you should not do, and so on. I don't know if that is dialogue. I feel if we're talking about dialogue with oneself, it's be the observation and the probing of whatever the thinking process that is happening in a way, if we can do it non-judgmentally without reaching any conclusion and so on, right? So in that way, it's no different from sitting with another person and doing it, right? Uh, I mean, so if you're having in a dialogue with somebody else and it's about coming to a conclusion or it's trading opinions, it's not very different from what we do with our conflicting thoughts or one thought competing with other within oneself. So I would think that dialogue with oneself is where there is some probing and pushing and learning that is happening at a kind of non-verbal level, right? And it feels like there was a moving in that process, right? And when that happens at the individual level, we could call that a dialogue with oneself. But that can happen with another. There, of course, you're talking and you're listening and so on, right? So I would say that they have to happen. Being at peace with oneself and being at peace in a group have to happen simultaneously. So I don't know if we can wait for one to start the other and so on. Right?
So thanks again, Shashi. That was
Thank
really a
you. Thank you for
wonderful
this chance.
session. Yeah, and thank you to all participants for being there and for some really interesting and thought-provoking questions as well. I'm sure we'll continue the dialogue in our own ways.
Mhm.
So bye, everybody. And thanks
Bye-bye.
again. Yeah.
Thank you.